From Impact Alpha, it's This Week in Impact, where we bring you some of the most interesting impact investing and sustainable finance stories of the week. It's Friday, April 11th. I'm Brian Walsh, and this week I'm joined by Impact Alpha editor David Bank. And for the first time in many years, we're in person together in New York City. We'll discuss the historic week of wild fluctuations in global stock markets as the world struggles to make sense of Trump's whiplashing tariff policies and the implications for impact investing. Plus, rethinking foreign aid at the Skoll World Forum. And finally, people, purpose, and perseverance, assembling the playbook for shared prosperity. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, David. Good to be recording in the same room with you. How are you?
I'm great, Brian, and it's terrific to be with you.
Yeah, we're usually via Zoom screen, so it's nice to see you IRL, as the kids say. And it's been quite the auspicious week for us to meet in person here in New York, the world's global financial capital. It's been a terrifying week, as they might say. Every corner of Wall Street experienced tribulations as the US China trade tensions escalated, sparking a slide in stocks, the dollar, and oil, with rampant disorder across the financial system due to Trump's on again, off again tariff policies. So, David, do you feel liberated?
Well, I guess we feel liberated to say some provocative things. You know, a lot of ink has been spilled this week, much of it red. We went kind of green and we called Donald Trump a secret degrowther. And the point was that the incipient recession, if it indeed comes, may be the only way to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as did the great financial crisis in 2008 and the COVID-19 shutdown in 2020. So we were thinking, is this Donald Trump's secret plan to get the planet away from the 3 degree Celsius warming trajectory that we're currently on? You know, that sounds fantastical, but maybe no more so than the stated reasons for the tariff wars that we're in.
Well, I mean, I guess if you wanted to cut global growth, way to do it would be to cut global trade. And this tariff war and this trade war that we're embarking on here is going to make the world poorer and make global output less. And so maybe there is a kind of a secret degrowther kind of play here.
Yeah, well, more seriously, though, you know, the tariffs are going to land very hard on the kind of clean tech supply chain. You know, there's solar panel imports from Southeast Asia. There's geothermal drilling gear from the Europe and Japan. There's uranium from Canada for nuclear. There's electric grid transformers come from Mexico and Canada. So, you know, even if you believe the somewhat absurd contention, you know, the clean tech supply chain as all is, you know, is really global, and so it's going to hit hard.
And speaking of hitting hard, I don't know if you've looked at your 401k balance this week, but it's quite the scary thing to do. And people are very scared about their retirement savings in this kind of whiplashing of a week. Uh, what are impact investors saying about this?
Well, you know, there's 2 points to make. One is that, you know, let's just be clear that, and actually Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, made this very point, which is that it's the top 10% of Americans own something like 88% of the stock market equities, and the next 40% owns the other 12%, and the bottom 50% has essentially no holdings in the stock market, maybe very small ones, and so they weren't actually hit as badly this week as it went down. I guess they didn't also ride it up when it went up, and then they didn't get hit as badly again when it went down. But there is a point there that there's a kind of real economy of meeting basic needs that's quite a bit different than the stock market. I'm not sure these tariffs are the way to give them some relief, but it does have an implication on impact investors as well, and particularly if you think about investments, say, in emerging markets, where most of those investments do go for basic needs and they go for local production and local consumption, and again are kind of relatively uncorrelated from swings in the market, and therefore possibly, you know, a safe haven or at least a diversification opportunity for investors to be focused on those kind of needs. I think it's kind of almost a truism now that in the 2008 financial crisis, things like microfinance in emerging markets was one of the safer bets. And you know, our friend Anthony Bug Levine makes the point that, you know, an African agricultural fund, say, that returns 10% a year, or even a deposit in a U.S. community bank that pays 4% interest looks better in comparison to the cratering stock market.
Well, ultimately, though, what investors need is, rule of law and stability and a good understanding of how things will work. And these kind of wild swings in policy that are really at the purview of just one person, Donald Trump, are really putting investors on edge, and people, are doing flights to safety. And I think that it is impacting impact investors, whether you are a fund manager trying to raise money from your limited partners, or you are a fund manager kind of looking to deploy that money into new investments, or you are a founder trying to raise capital from fund managers, or you're an asset allocator trying to balance long-term portfolios here. It's really scary times, and this uncertainty is breeding a lot of consternation among the impact investing folks that I've been talking to.
Well, certainly, and another thing is that might be helpful is a little sense of history, and folks have been making this point, and we did as well this week that some of the things that are the purported goals of this strategy, reshoring, supply chains, abundant energy, high quality jobs, lower energy bills, those were all things that actually were happening, in pretty recent history here. That back in 2023, the drumbeat of announcements of investments in building new factories, whether it's batteries or EVs or what have you, were coming like every week. And the strategies to lower folks' utility bills and otherwise, grant them some relief from the high cost of living, those were happening. So we might actually all agree on some of the goals. And then I think, yeah, as you say, a little bit of stability and a little bit of common sense to reach those goals might be in order now.
All right, well, hold on to your seats because this escalating trade war is just getting started, and there's going to be reverberations across the market and across the impact investing space for a long time to come. We'll be tracking this. But let's take a quick break now. And when we come back, we'll discuss what comes next for foreign aid in the wake of the Trump administration's effective dismantling of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Who will fill the tens of billions of dollars that had come from the U.S. government to fund global health and development and humanitarian relief in the form of the U.S. Agency for International Development? That was the big question at the Skoll World Forum in Oxford in the UK this past week. David, we had a guest post this week from Carolyn Bresson of Open Road, who kind of did a roundup of what was heard there. What did we hear?
Well, Carolyn Bresson and Open Road, have been heroic, and not just in this emergency, but in kind of all the emergencies of recent years. And they've raised a $14 million fund, and they are trying to keep alive some of the very innovative ventures out of the USAID portfolio. But $14 million, and she, would be the first to acknowledge this, is not even a drop in the bucket of what has been lost. And in USAID money, and also other countries are also cutting back. So there's a general pullback of this whole notion of kind of global humanitarian aid and foreign assistance. And the Skoll Forum, as I understand it, and I have to admit I wasn't there, really was trying to sort of think about what would be a way to move forward, in this post-aid world.
All right, so what are some examples of what's needed in a post-aid world?
For one, philanthropy obviously could step up. That doesn't seem to be happening on a scale that's commensurate with the size of the gap. The MacArthur Foundation has increased its payout rate. The Skoll Foundation at the forum announced that it was launching a $25 million fund to help its own grantees weather the storm. There was small announcements, say, from the Rippleworks Foundation, which cut $100,000 grants to counteract the freeze impact on their portfolio. One of the most interesting things that Carolyn heard at Skoll was about project resource optimization, a kind of wonky name, but it's former USAID staffers, and they've pulled together an analysis of all of the canceled grants and come up with a list of fundable opportunities prioritized by their cost effectiveness and how much is life saving in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of return on investment, and whittled down to $2 billion from that 40. So that's at least might be a sort of a number that could be met with a heroic effort.
And that's interesting that this was by former USAID officials. And one piece of this that sometimes gets lost when we're talking about the $40 billion in funding is the 10,000 employees of USAID and the human capital that has been lost with these cuts. And where is that human capital and all the knowledge and insights and perspectives that they have going to go, and how are, what goes out the door when they go out the door?
Well, yeah, exactly. And earlier this week, I was in Washington, D.C., and we were talking with some USAID staffers, and they were saying that they had been placed on administrative leave, and then they were called back apparently, but they couldn't get the notice of being called back because they weren't able to get into the email that would have told them they were being called back. So they had heard they were being called back, and they didn't quite have an office to go to, and they weren't sure where they should go to the office, and the whole thing is kind of a just chaotic mess. And as you said, that's not really an effective approach, regardless of what your policy positions are.
Right. It'd be funny if it weren't so tragic. Cue the Veep music ending credits of the TV show Veep there with some of the kind of kerfuffles that have come up here. So, one piece that I think that gets missed here is many people in the foreign aid establishment will also readily say that there are reforms needed and some of the programs are more effective than others, but we're still in the relatively immediate aftermath of the blast zone of these deep cuts to foreign aid in the U.S. And so there's still, I think, a more shoes to drop in as we kind of pick through the rubble of what's been left. But how are people, especially on the ground, starting to look at this and where to go from here?
Well, there is a sense, as you say, that the aid system was kind of, at some level, a legacy of a kind of, let's just call it, imperialist or colonialist kind of history, and that countries are eager and and increasingly able to stand on their own. And there was a minister from Zambia that Carolyn quoted from the Skoll forum, saying to the room full of donors, we've got this from here. Thank you for your help. And that, I think, is the direction that folks want to go: local funding for local needs. And the strategy and questions for the future will be to how to help folks and countries move along that continuum.
All right. Well, you can read Carolyn Bresson's full post on impactalpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. But for now, let's take one more quick break. When we come back, we'll discuss how we might assemble the playbook for shared prosperity. So, David, you've been on the road. I know you were just in DC this week. You're in New York now. You're going to Boston, showing this film, the mini documentary that Impact Alpha produced. Tell us about it and tell us about the reception you've been receiving.
Yeah, well, we started this spring tour in North Carolina, and that's the location where Napoleon Wallace, who's the subject of the mini documentary that we've produced, lives, and he organized and co-hosted and showed up at this event at the University of North Carolina. And it was an example of the kinds of things we've been trying to highlight in Impact Alpha: a local, place-based ecosystem of ventures and investors, general partners and limited partners, who are focused on what really are kind of the kitchen table common sense issues that we've been talking about: things that lower people's costs, that raise their incomes, that create wealth, and in particular generational wealth, things that give folks ownership of assets that appreciate, whether that's home ownership or business ownership, employee ownership of the companies they work for, and even financial assets, which, as we've said, might go up and down with the stock market, but people, building up their retirement security and also their kids' college fund, that sort of thing. And so we've been on the road, and we've been showing this film, and we've been talking about this particular case in North Carolina, a whole network of organizations there, but it's happening all around the country as folks sort of try to focus on these kind of, as we say, kitchen table, bread and butter kinds of issues.
What's the reception been like? What kind of feedback have you gotten from folks?
Well, I think people are kind of refreshed. It's one of the points we've been making. We had what we called a purple party in Washington D.C. the other day, and the point was that the solutions work just as well in red rural areas as they do in blue urban areas. That businesses need access to capital. Folks need sometimes a boost to get into the home ownership game. There's lots of strategies around that work for investors as well. Employee ownership and employee buyouts is getting a lot of attention now. There's as we've talked about, a phenomena of aging baby boomers getting out of their wanting to get out of their companies, and one of the very logical places for them to exit to is to their own employees, and that helps those employees build their own wealth. So these are not particularly ideologically divisive issues, unlike some other things. So I think that the response has been, wow, this is a kind of refreshing conversation to have.
So it's also reshaping the narrative here that there are solutions, but how do we actually shift the capital flows?
As Impact Alpha has long tried to point out, when you can build investable strategies that can attract capital, then you can go to scale quite quickly. And so we are building what we're calling a playbook for shared prosperity, and folks can submit their own ideas, either the things they're actually working on or the things they'd like to see. And we're going to come up with what could be an agenda, a playbook for investable solutions that make a material and beneficial difference in folks' lives.
So what are some early examples that you're assembling in this playbook?
Well, one that we highlight in the film, it's an outfit called Partners in Equity, and they help low wealth business owners buy the commercial properties in which they operate their business. So often that business, really depends on their labor, whether you're an accountant or a veterinarian or a beautician, and but the asset that might appreciate over time is actually the building you're operating in. And oftentimes, you've been renting or leasing that building, and you don't have the down payment to buy that building. And so Partners in Equity comes in. It's a sort of version of shared equity that's often thought more of in home ownership, but it applies just as much to commercial properties. And you get into the property, and the valuation goes up perhaps over time. You might refinance and take out the shared equity interest, and you're on your way to having an asset that you can either borrow against or you can pass down to your kids. And again, it's a way to sort of build wealth for low wealth people that goes beyond just better wages. It goes towards sort of assets that appreciate over time.
So how does this interact with the abundance agenda? There's the new hit book from superstar journalists Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson talking about how do we become a country that builds, right? And progressivism that builds. How does that intersect with your playbook here for shared prosperity?
I think it's quite consistent and complementary. They focus a lot on sort of lifting of regulations to allow more projects to go forward, more houses to be built, more renewable energy to put in the ground. And this is sort of the other side of it, which is creating opportunities for folks to create their own abundance, I guess, as it were. And like I said, to have a stake in assets and to have a bigger stake in the economy. And I think, they would say, and other economists would say, that this more broad distribution of wealth, ultimately creates healthier, communities, healthier families, healthier companies. And that's, the kind of society that actually, that's an abundant society.
Just taking a step back here in the moment that we're in the second Trump administration and all the uncertainty and kind of destruction of some of his policies, it does seem like there is, with abundance and shared prosperity, we're trying to create new counter narratives to the reality that we're living through, and trying to point towards a way forward and a future that people can kind of wrap their heads around about how do we get out of this current moment to a better future.
Yeah, I think so. And I guess maybe grasping at straws in some way, but the silver lining of this is that there does seem to be a coalescence around the notion that more people have to have a stake in the economy, and that going forward, that's kind of what both parties seem to be saying. And I say, like, let's have them compete for which policies can better deliver on that.
All right. Well, we'll have a link to David's post on people, purpose, and perseverance, assembling the playbook for shared prosperity, as well as a link to the form to submit your own play to the playbook on impactalpha.com, as well as in our show notes. But for now, that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Brian.
Great to be with you in person. And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh, Managing Director of the strategic advisory firm Human Nature. We'll see you next week for more impact.